Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second meeting on Egyptian myths and mysteries. Let's continue with our commentary. Here, I want to show you a slightly different image of cosmic evolution than the one I shared last time, which I'm going to show you again briefly. Here it is, but that describes the same stages as the other one. We are trying to get more and more familiar with different ways of representing those stages. In this second lecture, Rudolf Steiner broadens his description of the relationships between the earlier cultural epochs and the successive ones, and he describes the primordial conditions of Earth. He makes this comparison. In the origin, Earth is a seed, and just as a plant originates from a seed, the primordial Earth develops from a cosmic seed. That here is also called primal atom. Naturally, we are talking about a supersensible atom. When we observe the seed with the clairvoyant eye, for instance the seed of a rose, we can see the archetype of the rose together with its colors and forms that shine on it. So, when observing a seed in a clairvoyant way, it is possible to see that which will be forming, but is still in a supersensible state, in which forms and colors are still separated. Colors are free and move freely, and forms are as if transparent, a sort of transparent vessel. By observing the seed, one can see the supersensible rose, made of free colors and transparent forms that, as we said, shine on it. At the same time, it's possible to observe the streams of etheric forces that will shape the plant as it germinates from the seed itself. In the example made by Steiner, a rose. In the same way, through a clairvoyant view, we can contemplate the cosmic egg of the earth and see how it will develop, just as it was possible to observe how the seed of the rose will grow into a rose. Just as in the seed of the rose, one can observe the archetype of the rose that will finally bloom from the plant, in the cosmic egg, one can observe the human figure which will appear only at the end of earthly evolution. Just like the rose plant can germinate and come into bloom thanks to the earthly soil and to the warmth of the sun, so can the human figure evolve only in relation on the one hand to earth forces and on the other to solar forces in reciprocal relationship. Through this comparison, then, it is possible to understand how the rose will develop from the seed, and that can be observed clairvoyantly, so it is possible clairvoyantly to see that which is potential, and in the same way it is possible to see how the cosmic seed of the earth will develop into the human being, that clairvoyantly is already the human being in the supersensible realm. The farther we go into the primordial states of Earth, the more we see that all the planets, the whole cosmos, was united in this cosmic primeval egg. The moon, the sun, all of the planets up to Saturn were united in the primeval cosmic egg. The more the cosmos developed and became differentiated from this original cosmic egg, the more that which existed before in a pure spiritual condition became gradually manifested in a physical condition. So, the greatest potentiality lies in the spiritual, and then, through its gradual descent into the physical, this potentiality becomes deed, enters into action. In the first incarnation of the earth, ancient Saturn, which you can see here, everything was one. The entire cosmos was united in this cosmic egg. To a certain extent, it was so also in the second incarnation of the Earth, ancient Sun, when only the present orbit of Saturn had separated from this unity. So the whole cosmos, except for the orbit of Saturn, both in ancient Saturn and in ancient Sun, everything was still a unity, focused on a single center. The entire cosmos had a single focus, a single center. It was only in the third incarnation of the Earth that you can see above here, called ancient moon, that the Sun separated from the Earth-Moon mass. So a split took place that created two focuses, so to speak, one pertaining to the evolution of the Sun, the other to the evolution of the Earth-Moon. The evolving cosmos was a unity up ancient Sun and entered duality with ancient Moon. So, in ancient Saturn and Sun, there's still a fundamental unity of the cosmos, because there is only one center. In ancient Moon, a primordial duality is developed, with the presence of one center for the solar evolution and one center for the evolution of Earth and Moon together, still connected. In a similar way, this is recapitulated in the present incarnation of the Earth. So in the diagram, if you go down on the lower curve, but we can see it better in this image, you see the 7 metamorphoses of the Earth: Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan. Then if you look at the ones just above, these are called eras of the Earth: Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, post-Atlantean, 7 sigils, 7 trumpets. And we can see the stages that are recapitulated. For example, ancient Saturn is recapitulated in the Polarian era, which you see here, right above. Ancient Sun in the Hyperborean era. Ancient Moon in the Lemurian era. Earth in the Atlantean, and so forth. Therefore, the process that goes from unity to duality, unity in ancient Sun and the duality that came into being with ancient Moon, is recapitulated in a similar way in the present 4th metamorphosis of the Earth during the Polarian, Hyperborean, and Lemurian eras. In the first earthly era, the Polarian era, where Sun, Earth, and Moon were united, the human being was passing the mineral stage of its evolution. Then, already in the middle of the second era, the Hyperborean era, there occurred the separation of the Sun from the Earth-Moon mass. This event that recapitulates the preceding evolution, that is placed slightly ahead of time in the middle of the Hyperborean era, it's a pushing forward of the development, we could say, an acceleration. During the Hyperborean era, the human being passed through its plant stage of evolution. Just like for ancient Moon, this separation in the Hyperborean era came into being because some spiritual entities, we could say some streams, some life waves of spiritual entities, which were the more evolved angelic hierarchies, could find an environment suitable for their own evolution only on the Sun, whose evolution is accelerated as compared to the Earth. So, in the Hyperborean era, the Sun was the most elevated and most spiritual of the environments. The evolution of the Sun was guided by a sublime entity that Steiner tells us was called by the Gnostics Pleroma, or if we want to stick to the Greek pronunciation, pleroma, and that is also the name we chose for our own impulse. Had these events not occurred, the more evolved hierarchies would have fallen behind in their evolution and would not have been able to donate their own creative action to the cosmos. Other hierarchies, less evolved, together with the human being, remained instead in the environment that was best suited to them, which was the Earth-Moon mass. Therefore, this split into two streams, the solar one and the Earth-Moon one, came to be because the speed of evolution of those life waves are different. So, the life waves with more elevated evolution, the more elevated angelic hierarchies, stay on the sun, while the less elevated ones, including the human being and the kingdoms of nature, remain bound to the earth that holds the moon still inside her. All of this is appropriate. It's something that must happen. Otherwise, on the one hand, there would be a delay in the evolution of the more elevated hierarchies, hence the impossibility for them to express to the maximum creative activity, and on the other, the less evolved ones would have an acceleration that would prevent them, so to speak, from completing some of their evolutionary stages, and this would result in an incomplete evolution. So, on the Earth-Moon mass, there remain the kingdoms of nature, the human being, and the angels and archangels as higher entities. Earth-Moon was, from an evolutionary standpoint, the lowest environment, we could say, even lower than our present Earth. Why? Because at the time she had not yet freed herself from the moon, from the lunar substance. Present Earth, having freed herself from the lunar substance, can have a faster evolution, so to speak, than what the Earth-Moon had when the Sun parted in the middle of the Hyperborean era. It was only in the middle of the following era, the Lemurian era, which is a recapitulation of ancient moon in the present incarnation of Earth, that it became necessary for the Earth to get rid of the mass of the moon. The moon's regressive forces had become so predominant that Earth and humanity risked not being able to evolve anymore, thus becoming mummified. And so it was that the mass of the moon, with its regressive forces, was expelled in the middle of the Lemurian era. This act of expulsion of the moon, just as the sun leaving the Earth-Moon mass in the middle of the Hyperborean era, is a deed that was performed by the hierarchies. The hierarchies of the sun, in order to continue their evolution, left the Earth-Moon, but one particularly elevated entity among the hierarchies stayed to take care of the process of separation of the moon mass from the Earth. This deed, then, was performed by an entity who could have united with the sun in its evolution. It is a solar entity, but chose instead to sacrifice itself by remaining bound to the Earth and her evolution. This entity is called Jehovah or Yahweh, and it is the Eloah or spirit or form of the moon, Eloah of the moon, or spirit or form of the moon, or simply spirit of the moon, who extracted the mass of the moon from the earth, thus allowing both earth and moon to follow their respective evolutionary trajectories. With this, a dualism comes into place. Two evolutionary streams are created. The solar stream of evolution, directed by the pleroma, which is the ensemble of the Elohim minus Jehovah, and the lunar stream of evolution, directed by Jehovah. who breaks away from the pleroma and goes on to lead Earth's evolution from the moon. So we can say that the pleroma in a broad sense includes Jehovah, but at a certain point Jehovah leaves, makes a sacrifice, then extracts the mass of the moon from the earth and becomes the steward of earthly evolution, working from the moon. Let's bear in mind that the solar stream of evolution is 2 stages ahead compared to that of the earth. So, with respect to Earth, it would correspond to future Venus, when Earth itself will become a sun, while the lunar stream of evolution is a stage behind that of the Earth, corresponding, with respect to Earth, to what is left of ancient moon. So Earth finds its evolutionary current in this 4th stage, which is what we are living now and that you can see in the diagram. The Sun is 2 stages ahead, and therefore it's as if it were in future Venus relative to the Earth. The Moon is 1 evolutionary stage behind, so it is as if it were a residue of ancient Moon, which in fact it is. Following the separation of Sun and Moon, then, Earth can be seen as an intermediary between the solar stream of evolution directed by the pleroma of the Elohim and the lunar stream of evolution directed by Jehovah, who formerly was part of the pleroma. Jehovah, in fact, maintains a relationship with the pleroma in that the pleroma, the spirits of the sun, radiating from the sun sphere, bring their impulse to the moon, and the moon serves as a mirror. Jehovah performs a mirroring action that pours out these solar forces onto the earth. Moon works as a cosmic mirror. Thus, we come to the fact that Earth is situated between a luminous solar principle, that of the Sun, which is part of an accelerated evolutionary stream, and a dark regressive lunar principle, that of the Moon. Observed clairvoyantly, the Sun, since its separation from the Earth in the Hyperborean era, was a world constituted of etheric substance in its lower state, of abstract substance in its intermediate state, and of a spiritual substance. It was therefore radiating an aura. The Earth, on the other hand, once separated from the Sun, being still united with the Moon, was denser and made of etheric fluid. We can imagine the Earth-Moon as a sphere of fire surrounded by this fluid, which comprised also our current metals in the liquid form. So the maximum density of everything was the liquid state. Air did not exist yet, and human beings, who did not yet exist as physical beings, were passing their animal stage of evolution, corresponding to what will later appear on the physical earth as amphibians. We can imagine this supersensible stage of the earth, made of fire and water that meet and clash, in which the human being begins to acquire supersensible forms, that, once crystallized in the course of evolution, will originate the amphibians. This because the human respiratory system at the time worked through water, just as it is for amphibians. To supersensible view, then, the human being was a sort of amphibian, out of whose figure evolved, in a physical sense, the actual amphibians, when they crystallized in the physical sense world. In other words, we can say that the human being of the time was the archetype of what we call amphibians in the animal kingdom. And here you see an image showing the relationship between the spiritual man, or better, the supersensible human being, which you can see here, man at the beginning of Lemuria. And you can see the progressive development of the human figure and the respective and progressive crystallization in the physical sense world of the animals corresponding to the archetype that, one by one, the human being was taking on. Therefore, for each animal, and here they are listed starting with coelenterids, insects, and so on, primitive fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. For each animal, we have to imagine that the human being took on a form. In this lecture, Steiner starts with the amphibian man that we can find here, where it says amphibians, and as the human being takes on these forms one by one in the supersensible, these are progressively mirrored in the sense world in forms that correspond to those we can find, for instance, in the sequence of fossils through geological stratigraphy. So, there existed a supersensible human being that was the archetype of the animal species that would gradually appear in evolution as physical, crystallized forms. In this spiritual atmosphere of the earth, then, there was an amphibian man, or archetype of the amphibians, who projected out of itself the form that gave the evolutionary push from the fish to the amphibian, as you can see here. It is a projection of the spiritual archetype of man, in this case of the amphibian man, that corresponds to what occurred in the physical sense world on Earth about 400 million years ago in what is called the Paleozoic era between the Devonian and the Carboniferous, as you can see here, where the passage from the primitive fish to the amphibian is indicated. Thus, the human being has always existed, but as it took on forms in the supersensible in the course of the history of Earth, these would crystallize in the physical sense forms of animals. The last being that appears in this succession is the human being itself, in its physical sense form, and you can see it here in the lower corner on the right, present man, that covers the period from Atlantis to after the flood, that is, to the end of Atlantis and the beginning of our fifth post-Atlantean era. This human being, this amphibian man, in the sense of archetype of the amphibians, was the supersensible cause, for instance, if we want to imagine so, of the so-called conquest of land by some fish that evolved into amphibians, as you can see exemplified here, through the process of respiration, which went from being totally based on water breathing, with gills for fish and a combination of gills and lungs for the amphibians, to a respiration in air for the reptiles, which in turn evolved from the amphibians. So when we say fish, amphibians, reptiles, we are also talking about supersensible archetypes that the human being passed during the different stages of its evolution. This pattern is true for the entire evolutionary succession of the animals that we find in the history of Earth, and if we go further back in time, in parallel for plants and minerals as well. Steiner here focuses on animal though. Why? Because in Egyptian mythology, the gods are represented having animal heads. We'll see that little by little he's coming to this. So, he's basically saying that in origin the human being was looking at the divine through the animals. So the Egyptians portrayed these divine beings as having a human body and an animal head, which meant that those divine beings donated to humans specific forces drawn from the group soul of the corresponding animal. In the Egypto-Chaldean epoch, the third cultural epoch, the human being started from the astral body, which we share with the animals, develops the sentient soul, which we also share with the animals, especially the so-called higher animals. So, in fact, from the astral body to the sentient soul, which corresponds to the passage from the second to the third cultural epoch, it is the animals that teach the human being how to develop the sentient soul. We are obviously talking about the animal spirits. We could also call them spirit guides, totem animals, as intended by Native American cultures. It is the same process. For Native Americans too, the totem animals, the animal spirit guides, are in fact animals that help the human being to evolve in that passage from the astral body to the souls, and in particular the sentient soul. In general, then, we have first the appearance of the supersensible archetype, the spiritual evolution of the archetype, preceding and preparing the evolution that will then crystallize in the physical. This spiritual evolution of the archetype manifests itself in the physical evolution by crystallizing in the physical sense form of, for example, an animal species, though this is true also for plant and mineral species. This same general relationship between the spiritual archetype prefiguring evolution and the physical sense forms crystallizing is true for each and every stage of evolution. It is from this observation of the history of the earth that we comprehend how both sun and moon would have made it impossible for earth, the human being, and the natural kingdoms to evolve with the right rhythm. On the one hand, the sun would have burned evolution. It would have spiritualized it excessively, so that the successive stages of evolutions would not have had a chance to be completed. On the other hand, the moon would have had such a stiffening and regressive effect that the forms would have crystallized too much. So, with the sun, too much spiritualization and too little crystallization, and with the moon, excessive crystallization and too little or no spiritualization. The earth is situated between the two. So, if Earth and humanity had remained united to the solar stream of evolution, the Earth and the entire evolution would have been accelerated. If, on the other hand, Earth and humanity and the natural kingdoms had remained united to the lunar stream of evolution, the evolution of Earth would have been slowed down. This is important to understand because just as the human being is situated between the kingdoms of nature and the angelic hierarchies, Earth is situated between moon and sun. There is a harmonious relationship between these two evolutionary arcs, these two evolutionary dimensions. Now we can look at the human being in three evolutionary conditions. We went from 2 to 3. First of all, the primordial unity, when sun, earth, and moon were still united in a single mass together with the entities of the higher hierarchies. Then, when the sun separates from the earth-moon mass, a duality is created and the earth risks a regression in its evolution. Finally, when the moon is expelled from earth, a trinity is formed. Sun as the most evolved, earth as the intermediate, and moon as the least evolved. So we went from a unity to a duality to a trinity. This can be observed both by looking at evolution from the standpoint of the metamorphosis of the earth, Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, and by observing the eras of Earth that recapitulate this process: Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian. Once we reach the middle of Lemuria, we have the Trinity. So, Earth and humanity experience the passage from unity to duality to Trinity. When this came into existence, humanity felt nourished by the earth, which with nature, angels, and archangels could proceed with its natural evolution. And on the other hand, humanity was grateful to the sun, felt a sense of devotion toward the sun, because in it humanity perceived the higher hierarchies, the pleroma, radiating life toward the earth. They looked at the sun and its solar hierarchies as an ideal future development of the earth and of humanity. On the other side, humanity felt comforted by the presence of the moon, which shone in the night, reflecting the radiated light of the sun, and whose evolution had been taken in charge by Jehovah. We know already that the Lemurian era ended with the fire catastrophe, as mentioned in the first lecture, but also in other occasions, that destroyed the earth almost entirely. After that began the Atlantean era, and here too the spiritual archetype prepares the physical sense manifestation. We can see it here. I was saying earlier that the evolution of mammals in particular, and then of the primates, the apes in a broad sense, began mainly in Atlantis, starting from the Atlantean era. So, in the Atlantean era too, we have first a spiritual archetype that later comes to manifestation by crystallizing in certain animal forms. And at the same time, the conditions were created for the progressive solidification of what were the bones of the human being, for example, that would have then been completed with the actual appearance of the human being. So the conditions were created for the solidification of the earthly substance as well as of the beings, and more masses of land started to emerge from the waters. Initially, the Atlantean human being was still soft and inhabited an earthly atmosphere that was full of water vapors. It was still a supersensible human being. In the sense world, the beings that preceded man had appeared, going from the animal, so to speak, to a figure that is more and more human. Then, more and more, the human being came to descend in the vessel that was being prepared in the physical sense world, until we can say that it became solid with the solidification of the land masses. Moreover, the Atlantean human being was not yet self-conscious, but was endowed with a dreamlike clairvoyance. Steiner makes this example that today humans have a double consciousness, a bright day consciousness and a sleep or dream consciousness. For the Atlantean, it was different. For them, in the day consciousness, all of nature was enveloped in a fog, and forms were as if immersed in it and surrounded by a luminous glow and aura, whose colors were disconnected from the form itself. So the forms were empty and surrounded by a radiating glow and aura of colors. As a memory of that condition, it is still possible today to observe this phenomenon as an optical effect. If we observe an object in the fog when the sun is also shining through the fog, we see that when the rays of the sun hit the object, it darkens, and around it a reflection is created that radiates out and in turn reflects itself in the fog. This condition is similar to what the Atlanteans experienced in the misty atmosphere in which they were immersed. An opalescence of the forms. If you're interested in this aspect, this phenomenon is called broken spectre. It can be observed when a source of light goes through a mass of mist or fog. The shade of an object or of a human being is projected by the source of light onto the foggy mass, and around it a colored aura is created that delimits the form of the shadow. On the other hand, in his night consciousness, the Atlantean man found himself surrounded by spiritual entities that he perceived as companions, as beings that showed him the way. So the Atlantean human being was a companion of the kingdoms of nature by day and was a companion of the angelic hierarchies by night. He was still able to perceive them, though in a dreamlike consciousness. Here Steiner makes an important statement to which he will refer back again later. He says that the hierarchies that were thus perceived in the nighttime became the gods of all human religions before the coming of the Christ. So, to a certain extent, all religions before Christ refer to such entities as were perceived by the Atlanteans, and that had lasted as a memory because the souls that were incarnated after the Great Flood are the same that were incarnated in Atlantis. Therefore, they remember their direct experiences of the divine, of the angelic hierarchies during the night. This is also the reason why we find a parallelism among divinities belonging to different religions in the course of history. They all relate to the direct perception experienced by the Atlanteans. Experience that after the flood was preserved, in particular by the priestly lineage, all of this until just before the mystery of Golgotha, when it starts to decline. At the time described in the Gospels, this ancient dreamlike ancestral clairvoyance had already decayed. Thus, the hierarchies that were perceived by the Atlanteans during the night became the gods of all ancient human religions before the coming of the Christ. While the Lemurian era ended with the fire catastrophe, the Atlantean era ended with the water catastrophe or glade flood. After this, our fifth post-Atlantean era begins with its series of 7 cultural epochs. The first epoch is the Paleo-Indian, the second, the Paleo-Persian, the third, the Egypto-Chaldean Babylonian, the fourth, the Greco-Latin or Greco-Roman, and the fifth is our present European epoch of the consciousness soul. By going through the events of the Great Flood, which we have discussed last time in our first lecture, and through what we can call a diaspora from Atlantis, with these migration currents dispersing out of Atlantis, humanity lost progressively its perception of the spiritual world, so that around the human beings spread the darkness of night. So, during the night, we can perceive dreams, but generally, we don't directly perceive the entities of the spiritual world. It can happen, but it's not a common experience, so to say. Thus, we have a strong awakened consciousness during the day, whereas the Atlanteans was more dreamlike, while during the night we fall into sleep, while the Atlantean perceived the entities of the spiritual world. We can say that a double process occurs after the flood. The human being's sleep gets more and more captured by darkness, and its waking becomes more and more clear. A more and more obfuscated night consciousness and a clearer and clearer day consciousness. The dream clairvoyance was lost, and in its place arose what we call intelligence. This also means that the union with the entities of the spiritual world, the gods, was lost, and finally self-perception as an individual I was reached. This happened at the time around the mystery of Golgotha. Thus, in the first epochs after the flood, Paleo-Indian, Paleo-Persian, Egypto-Chaldean, Babylonian, Greco-Roman, in the cults lived a continuous remembrance of the relationship that the human soul had experienced during the Atlantean incarnation with the angelic hierarchies, the ancient gods. In particular, and Steiner gives us some examples, we can see how in the first Paleo-Indian epoch, human religious consciousness relates to the primordial unity when sun, earth, and moon were one. This divine unity of humanity and all the hierarchies from the angels to the seraphim is perceived by the ancient Paleo-Indian as Brahma, the creator of worlds. In the second Paleo-Persian epoch, human religious consciousness relates to dualism, light and darkness, sun and moon earth. The god of light, Ahura Mazda, also called Ormazd, and the god of darkness, Angramanyu or Hanuman. The good solar spirit, Ormazd, contrasts the evil, dark spirit, Ahriman. In the third Egypto-Chaldean epoch, human religious consciousness relates to a trinity. Paleo-Indian epoch, unity. Paleo-Persian, duality. Egypto-Chaldean, trinity, feeling themselves as children of the sun, the father, and of the moon, the mother. The Egyptians called this trinity Osiris, the father, Isis, the mother, and Horus, their child. So Osiris, solar forces, Isis, lunar forces, Horus, earthly forces. In the fourth Greco-Roman epoch, the remembrance of the gods that humans perceived clairvoyantly in Atlantis arises both in the Mediterranean peoples that were mainly part of the South Current, or of the South Current that had met the North Current, as we see here in this image, and the peoples of Central and Northern Europe were part of the Northern Current. In general, we can say that in the Mediterranean, the current of the mysteries of the South found its home. So the descendants of the Venus and Mercury oracles, here you see it in green around the Mediterranean Sea, while in Central and Northern Europe resided the currents of the mysteries of the North, descendants of the Jupiter oracle, the oracles of Atlantis. Almost paradoxically, though, we are used to thinking of this, but let's imagine that we are learning this for the first time. The pantheon of the populations living on the Mediterranean coastlines corresponds one-to-one to the pantheon of the peoples living in Central Europe and in Scandinavia. There are even parallel stories between Greek and Scandinavian myths, for instance. So, the gods of the polytheistic religions of the Greco-Roman epoch are memories of the experiences made with the hierarchies, in particular angels and archangels in Atlantis. More generally, we can say that any polytheistic religion holds the memory of such conversations with the angelic and archangelic hierarchies, the ancient gods, during Atlantis. To recap, we have unity, more strongly perceived in the Paleo-Indian epoch, duality, Paleo-Persian epoch, trinity, Egypto-Chaldean epoch, and multiplicity in the Greco-Roman epoch. Bear in mind, though, that these processes overlap the various epochs. So, as the Paleo-Indian epoch proceeds, polytheism will be reached. The same is true to some extent for the Paleo-Persian epoch and for the Egypto-Chaldean epoch that eventually create a pantheon. So, every process starts from unity, goes to duality, then trinity and multiplicity as its fourth stage, even inside a single cultural epoch, and in general between cultural epochs. For this reason, there are many Hindu gods, and they can be compared, for example, to the Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or Scandinavian gods. Because this process is repeated both during a single epoch and between epochs. Moreover, we have to imagine that, first of all, the archetypes is a cosmic one, ancient Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth. Then it transfers into the evolutionary processes of the earthly eras, Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, and then it becomes the religious devotion experienced by the peoples through the cultural epochs, from the Paleo-Indian to the Greco-Roman, and inside the singular cultural epoch, where this process is further recapitulated. So this is an evolutionary principle that, using more recent terms, we would call fractal, because it cycles inside cycles that repeat from the larger to the smaller, following a sevenfold evolutionary process. At the fourth stage, we have a reversal of the ancient stages into the new stages. And at the center, we have, as a pivot, the mystery of Golgotha and the acquisition of the I consciousness. Thanks to this image of a fractal evolution that gets to the point of describing the evolution of religions in the various cultural epochs, we can understand what could be living in the spirituality of our cultural epoch, the fifth one. We spoke about the first four, but what happens in the fifth? If the religion of the previous cultural epochs was based on the recapitulation of cosmic past, our fifth cultural epoch cannot be based on a recapitulation, but rather on the anticipation of future conditions. If we look at the diagram, we have spoken, for instance, of the Paleo-Indian epoch as being the recapitulation of the Polarian era and of the metamorphosis of ancient Sun. And we see that they are on the same column: Paleo-Indian epoch, Polarian era, and metamorphosis of ancient Saturn. The Paleo-Persian epoch is a recapitulation of the Hyperborean era, which in turn recapitulates the metamorphosis of ancient Sun. The third Egypto-Chaldean epoch is a recapitulation of the Lemurian era, which in turn recapitulates the metamorphosis of ancient Moon. The Greco-Roman epoch is a recapitulation of the Atlantean era, which in turn recapitulates the metamorphosis of the Earth, which is only half completed in what is called Earth-Mars, and needs to complete the Earth-Mercury stage. Therefore, if we are in the fifth cultural epoch, and the fifth post-Atlantean era is yet to be completed, and future Jupiter. So we have Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth Mars as recapitulations, Earth Mercury, future Jupiter, future Venus, and future Vulcan as anticipations of what will be the evolution, and that are the reversal of ancient evolution through the pivotal point of the mystery of Golgotha. Our fifth cultural epoch is not a recapitulation. In the great sense of evolution, it is instead an anticipation of future conditions. This means that in order to come into being, it cannot be based on a process that has already occurred, but needs to be based on a process that is occurring now, which is that of the evolution of the full I consciousness and of the attainment of freedom based on our free will. Thus, to cultivate our spiritual life in this fifth epoch of the consciousness soul, this religious renewal of the epoch of the consciousness soul, it is not possible to rest on the past, but we can freely will to anticipate future conditions. These future conditions can come into being from potential to deed, only through a conscious and free choice, because the fifth cultural epoch that begins in 1413 comes after the mystery of Golgotha and the coming of the I in human beings and in the world, that is, after the turning point of time. This is the reason why in our fifth epoch we can find three modalities for inner life. First, the return to ancient paganism that leads to a regression of humanity in the soul forces that were active before the incarnation of the Christ and of the I, so in the Greco-Roman epoch. The second one is the total radical denial of spirituality that we can see in atheism, particularly in the scientism, the religion of science. And there is a third possibility, third condition of inner life that comes into being. It is our turning to the condition of future spirituality, which is the resurrection of the ancient gods, but in a new form, completely interpenetrated with and centered on the Christ and the I. So we can observe around us there are three possibilities. Think, for example, of the preponderant return since the 1990s of the neo-paganism, Wicca being one of its main forms, though not the only one. Clearly, this form of religiosity, though responding to the need for spiritual life, is not a spiritual life that is centered on the I, or rather on the Christ. But it is again split into multiple divinities, which means multiple thoughts, multiple feelings, multiple will impulses, such as were donated to the humans by the gods before the mystery of Golgotha. After the mystery of Golgotha, thoughts, feelings, and will impulses start to orient and rectify themselves thanks to the I, the Christ I. The second possibility, no longer a regression to the ancient form of polytheism, is the total denial of spirituality that we can observe in atheism and even more in scientism, which is the religion of science, that is to say, the dogmatization of science. In so doing, by the way, it becomes an anti-science, as science by its nature cannot be dogmatic, or it would negate research and its consequent discoveries. The third condition is the most difficult for humanity. The first is regressive. The human soul simply goes back to the past. Denial means that the I feels itself real only in incarnation, So the denial of spirituality is merely a testimony of the fact that the I has totally incarnated in a physical sense body and cannot make a step beyond the physical sense world. The third condition, we can only will it freely, fully consciously. And in order to do so, we choose to be willing to practice a way for the development of soul's spiritual, supersensible organs. In this, a resurrection of the ancient gods does take place, but it is completely interpenetrated by the impulse of the Christ I. It is the Christ itself, then, who can guide us in this epoch to reunite with the gods. Let's call them angelic hierarchies, angels, archangels, archai, and so on, because the evolution of the I leads us anew to the spiritual world, where many entities dwell, but this time with our full consciousness. This is not neo-paganism, where the I consciousness abdicates in favor of returning to a dreamlike consciousness. As an example, one of the most desirable outcomes of initiation into neo-paganism is the ability to enter a state of trance, so a regression of consciousness. It is not a superconsciousness, but a subconsciousness. The path shown to us by Rudolf Steiner through the Anthroposophical spiritual science, on the other hand, is something that we would call, in quotation mark, a polytheistic Christianity, in the sense that in the center stands the Christ I principle. We have the return of the ancient gods only centered on the Christ I. Therefore, there is an acknowledgement of the fact that the spiritual world is full of entities, which we call hierarchies, and that were the ancient gods. But this time, it is we humans who come into contact, into relation with them, remaining steadfast in our I consciousness. Obviously, we are just at the beginning of this process that started around 1413. We are really in the primordial stages, taking the first steps, trial and error. But if no one dedicates any forces to this task, it will not become reality for a large part of humanity. Whereas we know that the anthroposophical spiritual science puts us on a path that means to take us from the present fifth epoch of the consciousness soul to the sixth epoch of the spiritual self. And the passage is precisely this. If I don't recognize the fact that the spiritual world is inhabited by spiritual entities, the hierarchies, I can't even realize that a spiritual entity dwells in me and that in my neighbor dwells a spiritual entity. If I realize the fact that the spiritual world is inhabited by a multitude of entities, among those entities are also the I of the human beings that have incarnated, as well as spirits of nature, of animals, of plants, of minerals, and the elementary beings, and the hierarchies who are on higher stages of consciousness, angels, archangels, and so forth. Thus, everything starts from realizing that the human being can raise to the supersensible. And by raising to the supersensible, each human realizes that the same can be done by all other humans, and that together they can establish a relationship with spiritual entities who have higher levels of consciousness and stand at higher stages of evolution. Similarly, we can recognize that there are spirits who stand at lower stages of evolution, which we call kingdoms of nature, animals, plants, minerals, and below these, the elementary beings. As we can see, a whole world opens up here, inhabited by entities and beings, accessed through a single key, the Christ I. It is the Christ that, once risen and become the etheric Christ, fills the entire etheric world with this high consciousness. This means that the human eye can access it by leaving the limitations of the physical body, because thanks to the Christ, we can find in the physical etheric body of the earth those same eye forces that live in our physical etheric body. Just as there is an eye in ourselves, earth has her own eye, which is the Christ. Because of this, we are able to consciously comprehend the supersensible world, and the first supersensible world is the etheric world, the etheric region of the earth. So the Christ has created this bridge between the human eye, which now can act outside the limitations of its physical etheric body, and the planet in a physical etheric sense. This as the first stage of the expansion of our consciousness. This is what Steiner calls the encounter with the etheric Christ. The human eye realizes that it can go out of the limitations of the physical sense body and recognizes itself macrocosmically in the Christ. This is the first step of the expansion of consciousness. The second step will be the Christ interpenetrating the astral world with the I am forces. At that point, the human being will be able to make a further step in the astral world. This will come about in the sixth cultural epoch. The etheric Christ comes in our fifth epoch, allowing us to go consciously in the etheric world. In nature, so to speak, in the sixth epoch, where will be an astral Christ, so we will be able to enter in full consciousness, not only nature, the etheric world, but also the astral world. And in the seventh epoch, it will be a spiritual Christ, or Christ I, when it will have fully attained the stage of spirit of the earth. At that point, we will be able to interpenetrate the lower Devakan with our eye forces. That is, through our eye forces, we will meet the Christ in the lower Devakan. In the apocalypse, then, the Christ will reveal itself in the yet superior dimensions of the higher Devakan. From this point of view, therefore, the Christ is creating the right conditions for humanity to expand its consciousness world after world, from the physical world where we are now, and that is the same world of the fourth Greco-Roman epoch, to the etheric world, which is the fifth cultural epoch, to the astral world, which is the sixth cultural epoch, to the lower Devakan, also called world of thought, which is the seventh cultural epoch. There, everything will be known through the full eye consciousness, with the entities that inhabit it, with the gods that we will know anew thanks to the Christ eye, and not by regressing to past states of consciousness, to a neo-pagan polytheism, or by denying ourselves this possibility, as small and incipient as it may be, with the scientism, the religion of science. Thus, in our cultural epoch, we can attain again a relationship with the spiritual world in a free, living, and conscious way. Our present cultural epoch is in fact suspended between the past, the regression to the past, and the future, the anticipation of a future stage. The key to reach that future is to unite the human eye forces to the Christ eye. The first step is to encounter the Christ as etheric Christ in the etheric forces that weave in the human being, in humanity and in nature. This constitutes the progressive expansion of the human consciousness beyond the space and time in which it is usually confined, toward the supersensible worlds, etheric, astral, spiritual. As we expand our consciousness beyond the space-time of the physical sense world, we'll come to remember our past lives on the one hand, and on the other, to have anticipatory visions of our future ones. This because we will no longer be bound with our consciousness to space-time, just as the Christ is not bound. So, in a sense, we will follow the imitation of Christ as the saints did in anticipatory form. We will leave the not I but Christ in me, which means that we will more and more live in the forces of our higher I, which is the Christ in us. We will then be free from space-time. And this new clairvoyance that will allow us to have both a retrospective vision in our past lives and a prospective anticipatory vision of future lives, this new conscious clairvoyance based on the Christ eye is what we can call apocalyptic consciousness. It is the same consciousness that John the Evangelist acquired when he leaned his head on the chest of Christ Jesus at the Last Supper. The state of consciousness that John the Evangelist developed at that event will be available for all humanity. So we can say that, in a sense, the anthroposophical spiritual science is the attainment of the apocalyptic consciousness, the same consciousness that John the Evangelist experienced when he leaned his head on the chest of Christ Jesus at the Last Supper. With this, I conclude this second meeting. Next time, I will recapitulate briefly the evolutionary steps from unity to duality to trinity, so as to make sure they are clear. And then we will continue with the commentary of the next conference. As you can see, things are repeated several times in different ways so that they can gradually drop into your consciousness. So don't worry if you don't understand everything the first time. It is absolutely normal and healthy. Let these images brought to us by Rudolf Steiner work in you, and we will try to understand step by step what is described. Rudolf Steiner himself will go over these evolutionary processes again and again, so that we can become more and more conscious of them.